Well, I can pretty much pass on now. I've got all that done. Alrighty, I'm going to put this in here. And I'm really disappointed that I wasn't here in March, the day we had that wonderful snowstorm, when Highway 79 was whiteout, and I had to cancel. But we still get in on the tail end of 2023. 75 years ago, this past spring, in the spring of 1948, the last runs and the salvaging of the Crouch Line, well, the last runs took place and the salvaging of the line, Rapid City's own Crouch Line, took place between Rapid City and Mystic. And with that, of course, ended a very unique period in South Dakota as well as Black Hills and Rapid City history. To tell you I could put 75 years since then, as well as the history of the line dating back to 1891 into a 30-minute program, you would either say I'm delusional or I don't know what I'm doing. So what I did is I put together about 20 images that I think probably are the most informative in some ways, and just a good variety of some of the images that are held by private collections, the South Dakota State Railroad Museum, and also here at the Journey, and also other collections around the region. There's not a lot of materials left on the Crouch Line. We do feel very fortunate that we have some items that have been preserved in Hill City and here at the Journey from their operations over the years. So we'll get into a few of those as we go on today. But one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you if you have anything to chime in on as far as memories about the Crouch Line or anything related to the topic. Chime in and right during the presentation, and that will kind of add more to this as far as I'm concerned. So let me make sure I know what I'm doing here. Yes.
Yeah, sorry folks, I forgot, just a reminder, please silence and turn off your cell phones before we start the presentation. Thank you so much.
Unless you have a really cool ringtone. Which I silence mine because you don't want the steam locomotives going off. Not that I'm typecast or anything. One of the things that has come up in different presentations, and even when I put together a couple of my books talking about the Crouch Line and some articles and stuff, how many names did it actually have over the years? From 1891 to 1903, which I call the beginning era of the what is now more commonly referred to as the Crouch Line. These are the four names that came up more than anything. And even though you look back in some of the some of the papers of the day, if you go back in the film or the microfilms of the Rapid City Journal, the first one that really started showing up, and if anybody has any other references or anything that they've come up with, I'd love to hear it, because this is an evolving history. We just come up with more and more as we go on. In fact, we were just looking at some stuff today from the Abe Harder family that came up from on the Crouch Line. So it's always a process, and I value my members and I value my volunteers at the Railroad Museum in Hill City, because no matter what, you're always going to learn more and bring more to the table as far as history, and we all know that as students of history. Early in 1891, of course, ground was broken on the west side of Rapid City, and a lot of the references at that time were to the Dakota Pacific Railroad. Now, I will show you in the next image, then some other names began to be used in different incorporations and reconfigurings of the name and of the charter and everything else. The one that I have a little bit of problem trying to figure out, because I've seen several versions, is there was the Dakota and Wyoming, but then there was also a Dakota, Wyoming, and Western. Now I'm going to throw in one more image that, the next one, that shows another one that is kind of a conglomeration. But I mean, as far as the names, it's kind of like the incorporations and mergers and bankruptcies. A lot of different names are used in certain paperwork to get to a point where the line is actually incorporated. But by 1903, when C.D. Crouch, Charles Crouch, who was a contractor on these first several small railroads, actually sued the parent company to get money for what he did for work. Many of you know the story. The long story short is, he sued the railroad and he ended up with the railroad in payment. Not just his money, but so he decided in 1903, roughly, that what he needed to do was complete the railroad on to the west and make a connection so that he could actually make some of his money back. Here's the one that kind of confuses me, and this was taken early after 1900 by the Farrar Photography Studio here in Rapid City, which a lot of this collection is now housed here at the Journey, and Mark can tell you more about that. And this locomotive, it kind of has confused me over the years when I first saw the photo, because his great-granddaughter, who I knew in high school, gave me this photo when I was doing one of my first books. And she said, this is really cool because it shows a logging train. Well, that was great, but I got to looking at some of the lettering down on the flat cars and on the locomotive. And the locomotive, and on the bottom of one of the cars, it says Dakota and Wyoming. Well, there's another name for you, but that's also an abbreviation for a couple of the other names that we were looking at. So, and these cars were used over the course of probably a decade or more in the logging and timbering areas west of Rapid City along what would become the Crouch Line, and also some of the lines that later on were built off the Crouch Line and the narrow gauges for the Warren Land Lumber Company and the Lanphier Heinrichs Company. So there's a lot of history related to logging and timbering west of Rapid City along the Crouch Line, and then, like I said, the narrow gauges that were associated with the Warren Land Lumber. And this one is just a fantastic image showing just some of the operations. You can see the tracks were literally laid on the ground, just throwing, pretty much hand-hewn ties down, just long enough to go in, get the logging done in the different cuts and areas, and then get out. And then they took the tracks out. So documenting a lot of these spur lines off of the Crouch Line and the Warren Land is a little bit problematic. There are certain maps that are available, like down at the county assessor's office, a few other places. We have a few at the museum in Hill City, but if you come across maps of either the Crouch or the Warren Land, please let me know if you can, or at least get them somewhere where this can be documented, because they were in such short periods of time, it's hard to document some of this. 1904, that's when Charles Crouch really took over and renamed his line the Missouri River and Northwestern, and that was used for about 4 years. But by 1908, that was the line's name that was incorporated by a lot of incorporators and investors that were from the Rapid City area specifically. And that's when it became known as the Rapid City Black Hills and Western. But from 1904 on, Rapid City and the Black Hills pretty much embraced the line, the nickname, the Crouch Line, because CD was doing his job. He wanted to get the line built, completed to at least Mystic, and of course, he had grand designs as well as the other incorporators of what this line could be. Basically, it was kind of the internet of the day, and as far as speculation, and it was going to drive the economy of the area, plus also connect Rapid City and the Black Hills to the rest of the world. Railroading, of course, was such a big influence on the economy in those days.
That's for a comment in, Rick.
Yeah.
You probably, you've got sources, and you've probably seen the same sources I have too. I went by the valuation reports, the ICC, and they show 4 corporate names. And some of those others show up in other places too. But those 4 are in the quote in the ICC record. Pretty well documented, I think.
And which 4 are you referring to?
Well, the first one is Dakota, Wyoming, and Missouri River.
Okay.
Black Hills and Missouri River. Missouri River and Northwestern, and then Rhapsody, Black Hills and West. Those 4 are shown in the, are you familiar with the ICC record?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, there's a couple pages of work on the internet.
And he's referring to the names of other, well, I would call them the incorporation papers for the line,
Exactly.
but which may or may not have ever shown up on equipment or anything else, and then were quickly sometimes kind of glossed over in favor of incorporating other names.
There was one that they changed the name 2 months later.
2 months, yeah, that's right. Yeah. So anyway, but yeah, and like I say, these are the 6 names that I refer to that I have seen the most of. And I didn't refer to the incorporation papers because a lot of those were very, well, they didn't last long. And for our purposes, you know, it's, yes.
And after operations continued for quite some time, it affectionately became known as the Rocks Crooked, Bucks Hard, and Wobbles.
That's right. Rocks hard, or
Bucks Crooked,
Rocks crooked, yes,
Rocks Crooked, Bucks Hard, BH, and Wobbles.
and wobbles.
RCBH and W.
That's right, that's right. We're just talking about the most, you know, affectionate and descriptive names, and the ones that we can repeat in pleasant company, you know what I'm saying?
This according to my grandmother and my mother.
That's exactly right, that's right. Same with some of the other railroads, you just didn't want to repeat them in this company, so. This was a locomotive, it was a 282, that was built by the Baldwin Locomotive Company in Philadelphia. And as far as we know, as far as I've been able to research, this is the only one that really came to the railroad as a one-owner locomotive. When it got here, they found that it was a little heavy for the line. But you can see when it came out of the foundry, it was really nicknamed and everything, MR and N, Missouri River and Northwestern. So this would be a 1904, 1905 image of what the Crouch Line should look like. Should look like. But if you remember the story, a lot of their equipment, if not 99% of it, came from other railroads in the early days. From the Chicago and Northwestern, from the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, and from the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. Everything was secondhand nearly. Locomotives, cars, track work equipment, and everything else was purchased secondhand. Except for maybe one record said that they bought a few of their own box cars, but I've yet to find a picture of one of their box cars other than it looked like a second-hand one that was relabeled and renumbered. So anyway, it was a second-hand railroad, and this was one shot. I I was in Denver at a train show, and this was, oh my gosh, 40 years ago. And this was in a box of black and white negatives. And I was just going through it because I was looking for anything, well, South Dakota rocket related. I saw this. I don't think I've ever spent $5 any faster in my life, because I had never seen this, before.
Did they not buy a couple of locomotives prior to kind of going broke in the mid-1890s?
They had some of those, but I don't know that they bought them, from a manufacturer, or whether they came from, those are 440s that I had, heard documentation of, or seen documentation of, but I don't know that those were bought new. Yeah. Now, at the same time as this was going on, the drive for getting a railroad to connect up with the Missouri River, and Pierre, Fort Pierre, and Chamberlain was underway. So a line was incorporated in South Dakota called the Federal Railroad Company. That essentially was planned at the time to be the line that went from Rapid City to Pierre and Fort Pierre. It was never built. So there was a lot of paper issued on it. This is one piece that was given to me by the great-grandson of W.T. Code, that he lives now in Mitchell. And so we have that at the museum. And we also have some other paper and memorabilia, stock certificates and everything else that came from the early days of the Crouch Line. Don't you love what the media and marketing does even today? This is what the Missouri River and Northwestern was going to look like. Rapid City, optimistic, connecting up with Burlington, and going on out to Buffalo to haul coal. Now, how visionary was that? That happened quite a few years before the coal boom actually happened in Wyoming. But this was their plan as of 1905. And this was their logo that they used for many years. And if you see it on different paperwork and everything else, and I know there's some housed here at the Journey, but it had the Crouch Line's key, and then of course to the Black Hills. This was going to be their big claim to fame, was getting another line into Rapid City. And actually the Burlington kind of took them up on this. The Burlington, of course, ran its branch line, the High Line, which is now the Mickelson Trail, up through the center of the Black Hills, through Mystic. That's where they interchanged with the Burlington. But with the Burlington's influence, there were actually 3 standard gauge railroads operating into Rapid City, discounting the Crouch Line. But the Burlington actually made rates on coal and other products coming into Rapid City. And so you can make a case for saying that the Burlington operated into Rapid City as well, but the Crouch Line was their agent. And for many years, that kind of subsidized their operations. 1910, this is after the line had been reorganized and called the Rapid City, Black Hills, and Western. This is after Charles Crouch kind of got out of the business, sold his interest because basically he still wasn't making any money in it, and the business owners and the new incorporators from the Rapid City area were starting to take over, and that's when you started seeing different nicknames. You saw Rapid City's Own, you saw the Rapid Canyon Line, and other references to being more of a local line than actually being a bridge route, which is what the original incorporators wanted it to be. This train on the right is, of course, a Crouch Line excursion train, and you can see that they have obviously been out on a picnic excursion or something along the line, but they're waiting to make connections probably, or waiting for a train to come by on the Burlington on the line in the front, but they serviced their needs through the Mystic Depot on the Burlington line. And this is a very good example of the west side of the Mystic Depot that the Burlington built after the Crouch Line was completed to Mystic in March of 1906. At the end of the line there in Mystic, the Crouch Line also put in a turntable so that they could turn their locomotives and motor cars. On the run up from Rapid City, they'd turn their locomotives, get them ready to interchange with the Burlington and Mystic, and then head back down the 33 miles on the canyon from Canyon Junction to Rapid City. And this is one of the only pictures I've ever seen of a locomotive, well, in fact, the only locomotive picture on the turntable at Mystic. And this is one of their early 262s, little prairie locomotive that was built, from my understanding, for a short line in Iowa, but then it ended up out here after 1908. Unfortunately, the Crouch Line had its share of wrecks, head-ons, rear ends, and other bad experiences. This was in 1910, and this is with the freight hitting the front of a demonstrator General Electric, what I call a doodle bug. It's basically a motorized passenger car. It had the motorman's seat in the front, a little section for the mail section, as well as baggage in the back, plus a coach section. From my understanding, this car was returned to GE and it never came back out to the Black Hills. Unfortunately, with this one, there were, depending upon the record you look at, either one or two fatalities. One was, of course, the motorman riding in front of or operating the motor car. We talked a little bit about the Warren Lamb companies and the lumber lines west of Rapid City. This one, unfortunately, it's a good shot of one of their little geared locomotives, but this was actually one of the Warren Lamb locomotives in service down on one of their lines in Custer State Park between 1917 and 1927. But this locomotive did use the lines between Rapid City and out to Sheridan, and also some of the other spur lines west of Rapid City, because for a period of time, the Crouch Line from Rapid City, the west part of Rapid City, out to where the Warren Lamb and the branches were, that line was 3-rail, which is basically makes it a dual gauge. Standard gauge on the outside for the Crouch Line trains to run, and then a narrow gauge rail put on the inside so that they could use the same gauge, use the same right of way, but run out as narrow gauge and then run on one of the other spurs. So there was quite a system of those. But once again, remember, a lot of these were built and used for such a period of time that the lines were never really documented on maps. So that's what makes it really difficult to really find out when and where some of these locomotives and cars operated on some of these temporary branch lines. One of the first locomotive photos that I found about the Crouch Line, this was in a collection from a photo that is obviously in Dark Canyon, and this was in the State Historical Society. But smaller locomotives, this happened to be one that they bought from the Milwaukee. But this is a very standard view of a Crouch Line train on the line. You'd see maybe a few box cars, tank cars coming from Wyoming. The guns that you see in the middle there, the gondola cars, hauled coal from the coal mines around Cambria and around Newcastle, and also out further on around early coal mines around Gillette. And then a mixed car on the very rear, that was for passengers, mail, and baggage. So, very typical consist. Here's a shot looking into the canyon. This was one of the doodle bugs, and it's hard to, in fact, I haven't been able to exactly determine which one this is, but this is, of course, another very serene shot in Dark Canyon, documenting some of the scenic opportunities and the different services that the Crouch Line tried to market as far as getting people to do tours in the Black Hills. Not the best shot, but this is a really good detail shot of another little doodle bug that was built on the chassis of a Mack truck. So they were experimenting on different ways to save money and not have to run the full-size trains. So if you look at the undercarriage and everything else on this, let's just say it's probably not something that OSHA would necessarily approve of these days, but still, you can look inside the side door there. There's your mail, there's your baggage, and people are riding in the back coach. And I'll show you another picture in a few minutes, but there's a little car behind it and a little trailer that was also combined hauling freight, baggage, as well as other seats for when this was not adequate to their needs. Probably one of my favorite views of Hysiga. Showing the train pulling up there really early on. And also, it's a neat shot because the car right behind the locomotive was one of their open air, they called them the tourist cars. And if you look at that, and if you're familiar with any of the rolling stock that has been built and now is in use on the Black Hills Central, the 1880 train, very similar. It looks like it's got a roof on it, it's got sides that are completely open, and that's what they needed during the summer, and of course that's what they really capitalized on when they were doing some of their tourist excursions. Of course, the 1880 train has kind of taken it to the next level and put plastic windows that can kind of roll down during thunderstorms, which are not all that uncommon during the summer in the Black Hills. And we have to explain to tourists why there's plastic hanging out here. But they appreciate it after a while. Back in 2016, I believe it was, the museum in Hill City received a grant, and we did some research on a collection that's held at the Denver Public Library from the Otto Perry photography collection. Otto Perry was a U.S. mail carrier in Denver from the 1920s to the 1960s. One of his favorite subjects to photograph were short line railroads. On long weekends from Denver, he would drive up to the Black Hills and he documented the teens, 20s, 30s, and 40s primarily of railroading in western South Dakota and around the Midwest, or I shouldn't say the Midwest, but the Intermountain West, up through North Dakota, Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, and he really had quite an affinity for the Black Hills. So some of the best photos we culled from that collection, and we published in 2018 in a book, Frames of Reference, that is out of print, but we did that as a museum. This is one of them that we picked up, and this was showing the Crouch Line. Now, if you look at what we did on a lot of these, we did before and afters. In that poster over there, you can see what was seen on Jackson Boulevard is at the top, and then down at the bottom, a scene of Mystic then and now. Well, this one is kind of interesting because if you look at it now, you can't see the hill behind it, but that's M Hill. And this train is rolling up right, what is beautiful, downtown West Rapid, and it's running on the right-of-way, which is now Jackson Boulevard. And so, but it's really a good view, and he had an uncanny, it's just uncanny. When he shot photos, he got the rods of the locomotive wheels almost flat, and he always made sure that there was a guy looking out the window, and maybe he just destroyed all the other negatives, I don't know. But this, as you'll see in the next few images, there are just some fantastic slices of time. And this was in 1937. Oops. Here's a better view a few years later, but once again, there's Jackson Boulevard and a Crouch Line westbound train, and you can of course see the outline of M Hill. And the cottonwood trees down there are about where Bacon Park is today. As far as I can tell, this is Otto's car that he parked in front of the train to make sure that it was preserved in posterity. But the first car on there is a log car. You can see the racks where they would load logs. But also, you can see there are a couple of tank cars. In the late 1930s, they started hauling oil from oil refineries in Wyoming and coming into Rapid City, and they were short hauling some of this tonnage coming into Rapid City and then going east on Milwaukee and the Northwestern. And the Burlington's actually getting their little bit of cut on the business as well. Here's another view of a little motor car and the trailer behind it. You can kind of see how the trailer was configured. You can see it wasn't designed for much weight. You can see there's no side frames on the trailer or anything else, but still it sufficed for what they needed on the passenger and freight service between Rapid City and Mystic. Here is a geared locomotive that was used by the Crouch Line for many years until it burned up in a roundhouse fire. But this gave you a view of how a lot of the locomotives ended up being painted and lettered back in the late 1920s, early 1930s. This particular photo was taken at the Deadwood Roundhouse on the Burlington. Apparently it had gone up there for service. And like I said, the Burlington worked very closely with the Crouch Line as well as the Northwestern and the Milwaukee for servicing locomotives and getting them by. The big railroads kind of took the Crouch Line under their wing, in a manner of speaking, and kept it running when they needed help. So there was a lot of common usage of equipment. Here's a picture of that same locomotive from the front, but this shows a train, again, heading out along Jackson Boulevard, and you can see a couple boxcars up front, but also you can see a bunch of log cars that are being taken out to be loaded along the Crouch Line, west of Rapid at the different log camps, and put into sidings anywhere from Johnson Siding up to Silver City. And then as different areas were logged, they could bring them down and load them on the train right there, and then either bring them into the Warren Lamb sawmill in Rapid City or go on to other destinations.
You can see the third rail.
Yep, let me go back here. Like Don just said, you can also see the third rail in there in front of the locomotive. So that meant they were still narrow gauge, and it was before 1939 when they pulled out the narrow gauge rails for the Warren Lamb. To Mystic, and then it will go into the side. This, and then it was an image that with the Burlington. I thought it was fantastic. Train and then back to Rapid City for many years. Market the main way and the schedule operated, and then we're calling the city in the Royal Gorge of the get into. My gosh, how grand is community. But hey, at that point they would either one freight and or pass on trains on the Burlington. Then they would exchange cars, and then they would come back into Rapid. Here's a shot. It wasn't an auto pair late after, but it shows a Crouch Line train coming in time to Mystic operation, and then of course the side interview. They're familiar with cars, history of the stories in Rapid City at the time. Make up a train. Somebody that actually wrote the Crouch Line for many years. It was just the main hometown schedule operated. And there were so many great stories with it. Get into Mystic, mid-time to get into, but I'll tell you what, meet either one, just freight and fantastic passenger trains on
Era.
Burlington for
And
railroad
they would
and
exchange
Rapid
cars,
City.
and then they would come back into Rapid and be back into
I
Rapid.
always try and
By
end
late
it on
afternoon.
a picture of a caboose.
Why?
Perfectly timed, Ricky silly that way. But this, of course, was
Any of you
a
that are
former
familiar with
Milwaukee
history and the stories of Rapid
that ended
City
up the time being, or some of you that actually rode the Crouch Line, or given for, it was just a great thing and how it worked out. Hometown
This is
operation.
number 4.
And there were so many great stories with it. This one, excuse me, this is number 2, a lot of time to get into. Number
But I'll
4
tell you
was
what,
the last one used.
it just was a fantastic
Last train that came down from
era
Mystic
for railroading
in 1948. The marker lamps, I always try and end the last train off of Solution. Why? Because Ricky's silly that way. But this, we also was a former Milwaukee Hero caboose that ended up being sold to the 55. We have more given for change of services depending on how it worked out. Russell Frank's father. This is number 4 before that train headed back to Rapid City. This one, and this is number 2. I apologize. Number 4 was the last. By 1948, the last train came down from Mystic Michael's company that bought all the salvage rights to the Crouch Line. The marker lamps, basically by the end of train number 48, on that last train, Crouch Line, caboose number 4, scrapped, are now abandoned. Railroad Museum in the city. We also have some of the equipment ended up on a couple of the other railroads here in the Black Hills. Number 55, majority of it, we have the belt from that locomotive. And unfortunately, to majority, Russell Frank's father went out before that train headed back to Rapid City. And so the pieces of memorabilia, hardware, 1948, and photos of the company out of Chicago, and Michael's company, few and far between. They bought all the salvage rights, the Crouch Line, and basically by the end of 1948, here in the hills, and I know there's still more of them out there. I know there's scrap of private collectors abandoned that have lanterns, some switch keys, some of the equipment ended up on a couple of the other railroads here in the Black Hills. It's been an interesting, majority of it was time to do some of the research and find out more about the Crouch. Went out in one of the boxes and was never seen again. I have pieces of memorabilia, putting together some of the hardware in my research. Photos of the Crouch Line are very mighty, few and far between. Western Rapid Canyon Line will allow on in our memories here in the hills. And I know there's still more knowledge. I know there's a couple of private collectors that have lanterns. Basically, it follows that and across it. It's been interesting how many times you went to 33 miles to do some research and find out more about the Crouch Line. Figure was over 110 bridges. It was just a serpentine line, putting together some longs that I found in my research. But, yeah. The mighty Rapid City, Black Hills,
floodwaters,
the Rapid Canyon Line will live on in our memories. Every spring, there's high water at the pool. But I can think of at least 7 times that there was real severe frost. And the first times, spring of 1933 miles, 1 year into the operation, and they almost had to figure it over, because that was the year that, it was just a serpentine line along Rapid Creek. And also the Northwestern lost track
How many times
down around Hermosa,
floodwaters
here in Rapid,
rail?
and then the Burlington had washouts up in the hills, and then of course the Milwaukee. Every spring, there was high water as where they were trying to build on the Rapid City. I can think of at least 7 times, that there was, you could go back and probably find. And the first one was in the spring of 1907. Damage. In the journal, 1 year into the operation, every year, and they almost had to totally rebuild. That was a fight every year. That there was so much flooding up on the Elk Creek, same thing like it.
Isn't the
And
Crouch
also
Line
the
depot
Northwestern
still
lost
standing in Rapid
track.
City?
Down around Hermosa, here in Rapid, and then the Burlington had
was the Freight
House, is what I call it. And then Milwaukee lost a lot of their track. Down where they were trying to build an interact with the big American flag on the side now. their engine house.
You can go
is-
back and probably find
And the name has changed,
recollections.
but it's
of damage
over on
by
West
the
Boulevard,
Journal.
and it was a
Every
chemical
year when the water came on.
but now
But I mean, it was a fight every year.
Right,
a medical service. Yeah, Jim, right.
Isn't the Crouch Line Depot still standing in Rapid
That
City?
building is still standing.
The Crouch Line, well,
So there
Depot
are a
itself
few remnants
but
here
what
in
was
town.
the freight house?
Is what I call the Hooky Jacks building down there on,
Yeah,
I have a couple questions.
Between
One
seven and eight.
unrelated.
It's
You
got
know
the
what
big
happened to the
flag on the
display at the
side.
Roundhouse Museum,
Yeah.
Roundhouse
Now,
Restaurant?
their engine house is.
The railroad display that they had in there?
The name has
It was
changed,
pretty much,
but it's over on West
either
Boulevard.
sold or
and it was
given
chemical
back to the
company.
folks that had
But
invested.
now I'm trying to think,
Yeah,
is it,
That was quite a display.
right,
It was quite a presentation.
Yes, they did a lot of work in there.
It's not
The roundhouse there in Lee, of course, that was Blackest, so there are a few roundhouse.
remnants here in town.
And back in, let's say, at least a decade ago, maybe a little longer. Some
I have
folks
a
put
couple
lot of money
questions.
into
One
restoration of
unrelated.
that
You know
building.
what happened to
After
the
it was
display at the
purchased
Roundhouse
from,
Museum,
Stan
Roundhouse
Anderson
Restaurant in
here in
Lee?
Rapid.
The railroad display that they had in there?
It was pretty much,
sometimes there's
a law of diminishing
either
returns.
sold
And the
or
rest given
given
back to the folks that
businesses
invested
that
in there, just never.
Yeah,
It,
was quite a display.
like we thought it
It
was.
was quite a
There was a
presentation.
lot of historic.
Yes, they did a lot of work in
preservation
there.
or, presentation.
The roundhouse there in Lee,
Of course, that was Blackest and Fort Pierce.
some of that
roundhouse.
been
And
preserved in the dead
back
area.
a few of the pieces actually came to our museum when we,
Some folks put a lot of money into restoration of that building after it was purchased from Stan Adams. He did that here in Rapid. Sometimes there's a law of diminishing returns. There is
And
still
the
a
restaurant
model
and
train display.
businesses that were in there
I
just,
I apologize, I don't remember the name of
Yeah,
the business.
there was a lot of
It's in there
historic,
now, but it's now a gift shop.
preservation.
Yeah, and then presentation, put in a,
I
think,
a bar.
some of that has
Pardon my French.
been preserved in the Deadwood area. A few of the pieces actually came to our museum. But no, the club is still there. And several of their members still work on our training now. The one that Gene Jackson started for us back in the day, and, but yeah, there is still a model train display. And I apologize, I don't remember the name of the business that's in there now, but it's now a gift shop. Yeah, and I think they put in a,
Time, or was it something
I
else?
think probably the most common, and I don't know whether it's the most economically viable, was coal. But no, the club is still there. Later on, some of their members still started seeing more oil. The one that Gene Jackson started for us headed to the Nader and out to Ellsworth. Yeah, we've got some activity around the Black Hills too, I think, when the Rapid City Air Base was started. But also, both the Northwestern and the Burlington gave traffic, I should say the Northwestern, Burlington gave traffic.
Something else.
Now, probably the most common raw, and I don't know whether it was the most, which was going to refineries and economically Western North was coal. But there was some jet fuel coming from Wyoming. Last couple of years, after you started seeing more oil, refined Rapid City Air Base started headed to either out to Ellsworth after. So 19. I would say that was probably the second. I mean, Little started past, but also both the Northwestern and the Burlington, but gave in traffic. I should say the Northwestern. Burlington gave traffic. Freight service from Wyoming were always raw that made the money, which was going to refineries. And yeah, it was always a touchy feely thing, the Crouch Line, but there was some kind of fighting for bills coming from Wyoming. And the after ailments, Ellsworth, one of the most famous stories that is related started, like Mildred Fielder, the Black Hills, was, so I would say that was probably the second. But I mean, Little up there on passengers, and it broke open. Well, instead of trying to collect insurance on it, but like, they just let the neighbors, you know, get all the candy and stuff. And they said the kids were sugared up for crazy, up along there, but, you know, then they made the money. They would submit a claim, you know, for the whole thing. Yeah, it was always a touching, but there are so many great stories, always that we were fighting the bill and down collectors and the derailments. Yeah. One of the most famous stories that was related in Mildred Fielder's book, Railroads of the Black Hills, was a boxcar full of candy. How do I that broke open? Well, instead of trying to collect insurance on it, they just let the neighbors pick up all the candy and stuff. I know they said the kids were sugared up for. In fact, months up along there, very passionate that they were bringing passengers to the plane, you know, for the whole thing. Because Amtrak is closest. There are so many great stories that Fort Morgan have been documented about Willis. Yeah, there's talk, real serious talk about putting, starting service between Minneapolis, Billings, and how do I go through Dickens? That's potentially, don't hold your breath. But as far as in South Dakota, I know the guy that, in fact, he's one of our museum members. I have to win the line. He's very passionate about bringing passengers and the rest of the legislature. That they're because Amtrak, closest we can get to it, obviously millions of dollars. Morgan to get the tracks back in place before a trail can even begin to think about talk. Real serious talk about putting, the one thing I will say, starting service between today Minneapolis here was Billings, and now get us a bus service. They will run from the Black Hills down to Cheyenne, if Cheyenne gets trains again, or get bus service, like a 3-day South Dakota Falls down to Omaha to connect to California. I have to win the lottery, but as far as having Mitch Christie and the rest of the legislature, that there have to be a subsidy of millions of dollars, that's gonna get the tracks back in place. I mean, I'd love it, a train could even, to think about.
Are those old telephone poles?
The one thing I will say, and that I've suggested to Dave when he was here was,
And go up
I said,
towards the furniture store?
get us a bus
Are
service
those old
that
trucks?
will run from the Black Hills down to Cheyenne, if Cheyenne gets the trains again, or get bus service. I'd have to look at it, I can't envision what you're connecting up to California, but I would bet not, but as far as I can't say that for certain.
They're very
Rapid
old.
City, it's possible, it's possible, I mean, that would be similar to the right of way, but I'd bet not, but never say
Are
never.
those old telephone poles?
I'd like to hear from Becky Swanson, whose granddad used to be an engineer.
Used car
Becky, do you have anything?
Well, it wasn't my grandfather, it was my late husband, David Jones' grandfather, on his mother's side, and his name was Abe
I'd
Carter.
have to look at
He
them,
was one of the
I can't envision what you've seen.
And so
But
I brought
I
a
would
picture.
bet not, but I can't say that for
At
certain.
my
They're
house,
very old.
at Johnson siding.
It's possible,
My
it's
house
possible,
was
I mean, that would
right
be
down
similar to the right of way.
Still there,
But I just,
from the
I
crash
bet
one.
not, but I mean,
And the
never
watch
say
sitting
never.
on the table was Abe Carter's
I'd like to hear
watch
from
that
Becky
he'd always
Swanson,
keep
whose
in his
granddad used to be
pocket
an
to
engineer.
keep the railroad on
Becky, do you have
time.
anything?
Well, it wasn't my
And then
grandfather,
I
it
found
was
some
my
pictures
late
as
husband,
well.
David Jones.
And when I was talking to Rick
on his mother's side, his name was Abe
I thought they
Carter,
were all
and
from
he was
Deadwood
engineering, because some of the photos have Deadwood written on the back.
so
I brought a
Bill
picture,
said
their photos
always
taken in
taken
Hot
at my
Springs at Johnson
And
Siding.
maybe you wanted
And
to
my
upgrade
house
that.
looks right down.
Well, the reason and I looked at them, and it's obviously a Chicago Northwestern
And the
engine.
watch sitting on
But
the
what
table
happened in
was Abe
1930?
Carter's watch that he'd always
there was a
keep in his
washout
pocket to
on
keep
Fall
the
River
railroad
in
on
Hot
time.
Springs. And it's separated
And
into
then
two,
I
they have the
found
joint
some
track
pictures as well.
between the Chicago
And when I was
Northwestern and
talking
the
to
Burlington.
Rick earlier,
it isolated.
I thought they were all from Deadwood,
Northwestern Engine
because
and
some of the
freight
photos
cars
have
in
Deadwood
their yards
on
in
the
Hot
back.
Spring, and they were
But
isolated
Mill said
both in
their
town
photos
and all the way
taken in
out
Hot
towards Buffalo Gap
Springs.
because of this flooding.
Maybe you
Once
want to
again,
elaborate on
flooding
that.
happened on all the lines at some point. The reason and I looked at it. What they did is it's obviously constructed Northwestern Engine, kind of a what happened, track and a really temporary bridge. They walked, there was a washout, the locomotive River and in Hot Springs, cars, and it's separated to the Burlington. They had a joint track between the Chicago Northwestern and the Burlington. Depending upon how it isolated, read this, it was different in the Hot Springs paper, the Northwestern Engine, and some freight cars. And their engine wasn't worth enough, and they were isolated Northwestern to get it out the other way, and all the way out. It was worth enough to give it to the crouch line, if they could get it out. Flooding happened, and so they took it out to Minnetonka, then up to Mystic, and then they brought it down, reconstructed crouch line, and number 142 fly track, a really temporary bridge, 14. They walked the locomotive and the cars up the track to the Burlington, which hadn't washed
I
out.
wanna know how
And the
many
crouch
people
line,
here, other than me, have
depending
been
upon
voted on the
how,
crouch line.
you read this, it was different in the Hot Springs paper and the Rapid City paper. The engine wasn't worth enough for the Northwestern to get it out. Tell us a story. And so they took it out to Minnetonka, then up
Let
to
me give you,
Mystic, and then they
give
brought
you
it
the mic,
down.
Fred. And then after that, we will have to wrap it up. I know some folks probably have other commitments, but I bet Rick will stick. Let's all give Rick a big round of applause.
I wanna know.
Very short story, I must have been maybe 7 or 8 years old. And the crouch line was a great Sunday excursion. Raise your hand, raise your hand. And told to the inn, for lunch and so on. And so they tell us a Sunday. Bernice and she had.
Let me give you the mic, Fred. And then after that, we will have to wrap it up. I know some folks probably have other commitments, but I bet Rick will, let's all give Rick a big round of applause.
Well, my parents cheered from a very short story. I must have been maybe 7 or 8 years old. And the crouch line was a great Sunday excursion.
If you don't mind, please take some time to fill out the survey on your table. We'd love to hear about how you enjoyed this program, although I know it's a solid tenure for Rick. And most importantly, we'd like to see you in the future, all right? And next Friday, that will be our last presentation. You'll take your leave. I'll give my last presentation as the curator of the city. We'll like a few years before last Friday. And then look for